The easiest part of a historic agreement is the announcement. The hard part begins the next morning. That is the frame through which this Iran deal has to be understood. The headline is dramatic, almost unbelievable. Iran has agreed to hand over its enriched uranium stockpile to a third-party custodian, a regime that spent decades calling uranium enrichment a sovereign right, that built facilities to the program from airstrikes, that absorbed sanctions, sabotage, assassinations, cyber operations, military threats, and diplomatic pressure, has now accepted a framework that would remove the material at the center of the nuclear crisis. That is not a small event. It is not a routine diplomatic development. It is not something that should be dismissed casually, just because the deal is imperfect or politically controversial. If implemented, the transfer of enriched uranium out of Iranian control would change the nuclear risk environment of the Middle East in a way no previous agreement fully achieved. It would make rapid breakout far harder. It would reduce the immediate pressure on Israel to strike again. It would give Gulf states space to breathe. It would lower the temperature around the Strait of Hormuz. It would show that military pressure and diplomatic channels, when fused carefully, can force a hardened adversary to accept a concession it once called impossible. But that is only one side of the story. The other side is this. A deal this significant is also fragile precisely because so much is being asked of it. It is being asked to reopen one of the world's most important energy corridors. It is being asked to restrain Iran's nuclear program. It is being asked to preserve U.S. credibility. It is being asked to reassure Israel. It is being asked to calm oil markets. It is being asked to satisfy Gulf partners. It is being asked to avoid empowering Iran's proxy network. It is being asked to show China and Russia that American pressure can still produce results. It is being asked to do all of that while the public text, the verification details, and the long-term settlement remain unsettled. That is why the real story is not simply that Iran blinked. The real story is whether the United States can enforce the consequences of Iran blinking. There is a huge difference between forcing an adversary to sign a framework and building a structure that survives implementation. The first can happen in a burst of military diplomacy. The second requires discipline. It requires inspectors, it requires sequencing, it requires legal mechanisms, it requires sustained attention after television cameras move on. It requires the kind of patient enforcement that is much less exciting than airstrikes, but far more important to history. The transcript's central claim is that Iran agreed to hand over enriched uranium, suspend enrichment activities, recognize the international status of the Strait of Hormuz, accept phased relief from the blockade, gain access to frozen assets only through compliance benchmarks, and leave the unresolved proxy question for a later track. That is a large package. It combines nuclear risk reduction, maritime security, economic pressure relief, and regional diplomacy into one framework. That combination is both the deal's strength and its danger. It is strong because the pieces reinforce one another. Iran wants financial relief, oil access, and an end to the blockade. The United States wants the uranium out of Iranian hands, enrichment suspended, Hormuz reopened, and the region stabilized. Gulf states want shipping restored and missile threats reduced. Qatar and Oman want to turn mediation into a durable diplomatic architecture. China wants oil flowing again. Europe wants the crisis cooled before inflation and energy insecurity spread. Israel wants Iran pushed back from a nuclear threshold. The framework gives every player something to point to. But it is dangerous, because each piece can also become a point of failure. If the uranium transfer stalls, the nuclear section collapses. If the Strait of Hormuz remains unsafe, the economic benefits fail. If frozen assets are released too quickly, critics will say Iran got paid before compliance. If assets are released too slowly, Tehran may accuse Washington of bad faith. If Israel believes the proxy network remains untouched, it may act outside the deal. If Iran's hardliners believe the agreement is humiliation, they may sabotage implementation from within. If the United States declares victory too early, it may lose the leverage needed for the next phase. This is not a simple peace agreement, it is a machine with many moving parts, and every moving part has enemies. The uranium transfer is the centerpiece. It is the one element that, if real and verifiable, changes the conversation immediately. Iran's nuclear danger has never been only about facilities. It has also been about material. Centrifuges matter, enrichment levels matter, underground tunnels matter, weaponization research matters. But the enriched uranium stockpile is the physical asset that gives the program its urgency. That is why removal matters so much. If Iran's enriched material is placed under credible third-party custody, the world no longer has to rely only on promises that Iran will not enrich further or weaponize. It can count, seal, monitor, and verify the material outside the immediate control of Tehran's nuclear bureaucracy. That is a stronger starting point than asking Iran to simply declare restraint while keeping the stockpile at home. But the word transfer hides a mountain of technical questions. How much material is included? Does the transfer cover low-enriched uranium, 20% material, 60% material, uranium and other chemical forms, scrap intermediate products, and material held at sites the IAEA has not recently accessed? What is the baseline inventory? Who confirms the weight and enrichment levels? What happens if Iran disputes the numbers? Who guards them? Where are they stored in Oman? What legal authority governs custody? Can Iran request return of the material under any circumstance? Can the United States or the IAEA inspect the storage location? Can international monitors confirm that nothing was diverted before transfer? These are not minor details. These are the deal. The history of nuclear diplomacy is filled with agreements that sounded strong in political language but weakened under technical pressure. A single ambiguous phrase can become a loophole. A delayed inspection can become a dispute. A dispute can become non-compliance. Non-compliance can become a crisis. That is why the uranium transfer must be treated less like a diplomatic promise and more like a controlled chain of custody operation. If the material cannot be counted, it cannot be trusted. If it cannot be tracked, it cannot be verified. If it cannot be verified, the deal becomes a gamble. That is especially important because Iran's relationship with inspectors has deteriorated badly in recent years. The IAEA's access problems matter because they mean the international community may not have a fully verified picture of Iran's stockpile, centrifuge inventory, or enrichment activity. The transcript assumes a comprehensive transfer, but a comprehensive transfer requires a large amount of material. Without that baseline, Iran could hand over a large amount of material, about whether all of it has been removed. That is the first trap. A visible concession can hide an invisible gap. The United States and its partners cannot afford to confuse a lot of uranium moved with all relevant uranium accounted for. Those are different statements. One is politically useful, the other is strategically necessary. The second major piece is the suspension of enrichment. This is another area where language matters. The transcript correctly notes that an indefinite suspension is not the same as dismantlement. That distinction will drive much of the political fight in Washington and Israel. Suspension means Iran stops enrichment activity under agreed conditions. Dismantlement means Iran loses the infrastructure necessary to restart quickly. Those are not the same thing. A suspension can reduce immediate danger, but it leaves the future open. It may be enough to lengthen breakout time, calm markets, and support negotiations. But it does not answer the long-term question: will Iran retain a civilian enrichment capability under inspection, or will it be required to abandon domestic enrichment entirely? That question has haunted every Iran negotiation for decades because it sits at the intersection of sovereign pride, national capability, weapons risk, and regional trust. Iran has long framed enrichment as a national right. The United States and Israel have often viewed Iran's enrichment infrastructure as inherently dangerous because the same broad technical pathway that produces civilian fuel can, at higher enrichment and under different conditions, support a weapons program. That tension does not disappear because a framework is announced. It simply moves into the next negotiating phase. That is why the 60-day window matters so much. A short extension can be useful if it creates urgency. It can also become a trap if the hard questions are merely deferred. Iran may use the period to seek economic relief while avoiding irreversible concessions. The United States may use it to claim political success while postponing the toughest decisions. Israel may view the delay as dangerous. Gulf states may worry that Iran is being rewarded before its regional behavior changes. A pause is not a settlement. A pause is a test. During that test, every side will probe the others. Iran will test whether Washington is willing to reimpose pressure. Washington will test whether Iran is serious about compliance. Israel will test whether the deal truly reduces the threat. Gulf states will test whether the Strait of Hormuz is safe. China will test whether oil supply is stable. Russia will test whether American attention is still divided. Militias will test whether the ceasefire constrains them. That is why the deal's first 60 to 90 days may be more important than the signing ceremony itself. The Strait of Hormuz is the third major element, and it may be the fastest way for the world to judge whether the framework is real. Hormuz is not an abstract waterway. It is one of the most important arteries in the global energy system. When traffic through Hormuz is threatened, the consequences spread quickly through oil prices, LNG markets, tanker insurance, shipping schedules, inflation expectations, and political pressure on governments. Iran understands that. That is why the Strait has always been one of Tehran's most powerful tools. Iran does not have to defeat the U.S. Navy to create global consequences. It only has to make enough companies believe the waterway is unsafe. Mines, drones, fast boats, missile threats, harassment operations, ambiguous warnings, and claims of control can all raise risk. Once risk rises, insurers respond. Once insurers respond, shipping firms hesitate. Once shipping firms hesitate, markets move. The framework's Hormuz provisions therefore matter enormously. If Iran truly recognizes the Strait as an open international passage, stops harassment, clears mines, oil, and commercial shipping to move freely, the agreement gains credibility quickly. If traffic resumes but only under Iranian conditions, coordination requirements, fees, inspections, or pressure from the IRGC, then the dispute is not resolved. It has only been repackaged. The difference between reopening Hormuz and letting Iran manage access to Hormuz is not a technicality. It is the difference between freedom of navigation and a hostage system with paperwork. That is why shipping companies are right to be cautious. Politicians can say the Strait is open through it. An insurer has to price the risk. A company has to decide whether a vessel, cargo, crew, and route are worth the danger. A naval escort can reduce risk, but it cannot erase it. If mines remain, if IRGC boats keep operating aggressively, if maritime coordination becomes coercive, or if the ceasefire looks fragile, the strait may remain open in theory and unstable in practice. On a minus, this is where the deal becomes measurable. On a watch the tankers. On a watch the insurance rates. On a watch the escort patterns. On a watch whether Asian buyers resume normal purchasing. On a watch whether oil prices stay calm after the first week. On a watch whether Iran's maritime warnings become less ambiguous or more controlling. On a watch whether the IRGC treats the agreement as binding or as a temporary tactic. On a the Strait of Hormuz will reveal the truth faster than any press conference. On a the fourth component is financial relief, and this may become the most politically explosive part of the deal inside the United States. The transcript describes phased access to frozen assets, tied to compliance benchmarks rather than delivered up front. Outside reporting also points to sanctions relief, oil sales, financial services, and possibly a large reconstruction or development fund. The basic logic is understandable. Iran needs money. Its economy has been battered by sanctions, war, infrastructure damage, blockade pressure, and domestic stress. If Tehran is going to accept major concessions, it wants proof that compliance will produce real relief. Washington, meanwhile, wants to avoid giving Iran money up front without ensuring implementation. That creates a sequencing fight. Iran wants relief before full compliance. The United States wants compliance before full relief. This is one of the hardest problems in sanctions diplomacy. If Washington gives too much too soon, it loses leverage. If Washington gives too little too late, Iran may walk away. If the money flows through opaque side channels, critics will call it a hidden payoff. If Gulf states, private investors, or escrow structures are used, questions will emerge about control, oversight, and whether money can be diverted to military or proxy purposes. This is not only about dollars, it is about trust, leverage, and political legitimacy. The phrase frozen assets can make relief sound simple, as if someone merely unlocks a bank account. In reality, sanctions relief is complicated. Funds are trapped across jurisdictions. Banks fear U.S. penalties, reputational risk. Governments may impose conditions. Even after formal relief, private institutions may hesitate. Iran may demand access that the banking system is reluctant to provide. Washington may promise relief that the market does not fully deliver. That means the economic side of the agreement may disappoint Tehran even if Washington technically complies. That creates danger. If Iran believes it gave up nuclear leverage and reopened Hormuz but did not receive meaningful economic benefit, hardliners will argue that diplomacy failed. If American critics believe Iran is getting rich while proxies remain active, they will argue the administration has repeated past mistakes. Both narratives can damage the deal from opposite sides. This is why the financial mechanism must be transparent enough to sustain political support and controlled enough to prevent misuse. Escrow arrangements may help. Phased releases may help. Project-based reconstruction funding may help, third-party monitoring may help, but none of it will work if the public believes the money is being hidden, laundered through intermediaries, or released without visible Iranian compliance. The fifth component is the unresolved proxy network, and this is the deal's most obvious strategic weakness. The transcript is honest about that. It says the language on Iranian proxy relationships and IRGCs is aspirational rather than binding. That means the nuclear file and Hormuz are being treated as immediate problems, while Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and other Iranian-linked networks are being pushed into a later track. That may be necessary. It is also dangerous. There is a strong argument for prioritization. A nuclear-armed Iran would transform every regional problem into something far more dangerous. Hezbollah with Iranian support is a major threat. Hezbollah under the shadow of a nuclear-armed Iran would be a much more dangerous threat. Houthi disruption of shipping is serious. Houthi disruption backed by a nuclear threshold state would be more serious. Iranian missile and proxy activity is destabilizing. Iranian missile and proxy activity under nuclear deterrence would be far harder to counter. So from a sequencing perspective, dealing with the nuclear material first makes sense. But from an Israeli Gulf and regional security perspective, leaving the proxy network intact means Iran retains a powerful method of pressure. It can comply on uranium while escalating indirectly. It can avoid direct violation while letting aligned groups test the ceasefire. It can preserve deniability. It can use proxies as insurance against future strikes. It can tell domestic hardliners that the revolution's regional arm remains alive. That is why Israel will be deeply skeptical. Israel was not the central party to these negotiations, yet it lives closest to many of the consequences. A deal that removes enriched uranium may reduce the existential nuclear danger, but it does not necessarily stop rockets, drones, tunnels, militia activity, or Iranian influence in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza. Israeli leaders will ask whether the agreement prevents the next war or merely changes its shape. That concern should not be dismissed. At the same time, the counter-argument has weight. A financially weakened Iran, with damaged military export systems and enriched uranium removed from its control, is less capable than the Iran that existed before the conflict. Even if proxies remain, their funding, supply lines, confidence, and strategic backing may be degraded. The regime may still want to project power, but it may have less capacity to do so aggressively. That becomes the key question. Has Iran's behavior changed or only its capability? If only capability has changed, the deal may buy time. If behavior begins to change as well, the deal may reshape the region. But behavior is harder to verify than uranium. You can count containers of nuclear material, you can monitor enrichment sites, you can track oil shipments, you can inspect a corridor in Hormuz. But how do you verify that Iran has stopped encouraging Hezbollah? How do you prove a militia attack was or was not ordered from Tehran? How do you distinguish ideological alignment from operational direction? How do you punish deniable support without collapsing the nuclear agreement? This is where the agreement may face its first major crisis. A proxy attack could happen during the implementation window. Israel could respond. Iran could deny responsibility. Washington could be forced to choose between defending the deal and backing its ally. Gulf states could demand enforcement. Tehran could claim the United States is acting in bad faith. A single event in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, or the Red Sea could suddenly put the entire framework under pressure. That is why the proxy question cannot remain aspirational for long. It needs a follow-on mechanism with consequences, not vague language, not hopeful diplomacy. A real structure, reporting, sanctions triggers, interdiction rules, funding restrictions, weapons transfer monitoring, and consequences for violations. Without that, the nuclear deal may survive while the regional war continues through different channels. The pressure campaign that produced the deal is the sixth major theme. The transcript presents the campaign as a case study in coercive diplomacy. The Apache shoot-down triggered escalation. Radar strikes degraded Iran's ability to see and coordinate around Hormuz. Karg Island operations put Iran's oil lifeline at risk. B-2 strikes against hardened facilities showed that mountains were no longer safe, and the Qatari back channel kept an exit open while military pressure increased. That is a compelling narrative. It also needs careful handling. Coercive diplomacy works only when pressure and exit are balanced. Pressure without an exit becomes pleading. The genius of a successful campaign lies in making the adversary believe that accepting the deal is less dangerous than refusing it, while still giving that adversary a path to step down without total humiliation. According to the transcript's logic, that is what happened. Iran saw the trajectory. It realized the next phase could threaten not only military infrastructure, but the institutional continuity of the regime itself. It chose the off-ramp. If that is accurate, it would be one of the clearest demonstrations in modern Middle Eastern conflict of force being used not for regime change, but to compel a specific strategic concession. But there is a moral and strategic hazard in celebrating coercion too easily. Military pressure can force concessions. It can also create resentment, civilian suffering, regional instability, and incentives for future revenge. If the deal is enforced well, the pressure campaign may be remembered as the harsh medicine that prevented a nuclear crisis. If enforcement fails, the campaign may be remembered as a destructive war that ended in an unstable pause. History does not judge coercive diplomacy by whether the other side signs. It judges it by whether the outcome holds. That is why the Trump statement described in the transcript, "Trust but verify, actually just verify," captures the right instinct, even if the politics around it are messy. Verification must be the center, not trust, not optimism, not personal confidence, not presidential branding. Verification. Verify the uranium. Verify enrichment suspension. Verify Hormuz access. Verify mine clearance. Verify asset release benchmarks. Verify sanctions compliance. Verify proxy restraint where possible. Verify every claim before making the next concession. That is the only way this framework becomes durable. The comparison with the JCPOA will be unavoidable. Supporters of the new framework will argue that this deal is stronger because it physically removes uranium and is backed by recent demonstrated U.S. military willingness. Critics will argue that Trump withdrew from the earlier agreement, helped create the conditions for Iran's later stockpile growth, then fought a war that brought Washington back to a version of the same problem. How to limit Iran's nuclear program through inspection, sanctions relief, and diplomacy. Both sides will use history selectively. The more useful approach is to ask what lessons were learned. From the JCPOA, one lesson is that verification must be strong, persistent, and politically defended. Another is that sanctions relief must be real enough to sustain Iranian compliance, but not so broad that Iran can pocket benefits while cheating. Another is that an agreement without durable political support in Washington is vulnerable to reversal. Another is that excluding regional security concerns creates space for opponents to attack the deal as too narrow. This framework appears to respond to some of those lessons, especially if uranium removal is real and snapback mechanisms are stronger, but it may still repeat others if the proxy network, missile program, and regional conflicts remain unresolved. That is the balance. This deal could be better than the JCPOA in some ways and still incomplete in dangerous ways. It could be a real achievement and still not a final settlement. It could reduce the nuclear threat and still leave the region unstable. Serious analysis has to hold all of those truths at once. The China dimension adds another layer. Beijing has two competing interests. It wants Gulf oil flows restored because energy disruption hurts China. It also dislikes any precedent showing that economic blockade and coalition diplomacy can force a defiant state into concessions. China will study this campaign for lessons about Taiwan, the South China Sea, gray zone operations, blockade risk, and the credibility of U.S. escalation. If Beijing concludes that Washington remains capable of coordinating force, finance, and diplomacy under pressure, it may become more cautious. If it concludes that the U.S. was stretched thin, reliant on risky escalation, or politically exhausted by the conflict, it may become bolder. That is why the implementation phase matters globally. The military campaign got China's attention. The enforcement phase will tell China whether American strategy is sustainable. Russia will read the deal differently. Moscow may emphasize that war eventually returns to negotiation, using the Iran framework as propaganda for pressuring Ukraine into concessions. At the same time, Russian military planners will study the performance of U.S. stealth aircraft, bombers, missile defense, electronic warfare, intelligence integration, and regional coalition operations. They will not dismiss the operational lessons simply because Russian media may frame the diplomatic outcome as proof that force has limits. Every major power will take something from this. For the United States, that means the Iran deal is not only about Iran. It is a test case of American power in an era of linked theaters. What happens in the Gulf affects perceptions in the Taiwan Strait. What happens in Taiwan Strait affects NATO planning. What happens on NATO's eastern flank affects Moscow's risk tolerance. What happens with energy markets affects domestic politics in the United States. What happens with congressional oversight affects the legitimacy of the agreement. The world is too connected for this deal to stay regional. That is why implementation must be treated as a global credibility operation. The U.S. has to show that it can do more than strike. It has to show it can sequence pressure, organize allies, manage markets, sustain verification, deter spoilers, and avoid overreach. It has to show that the war did not merely produce a temporary document, but a new strategic reality. The first step is clarity. The public text of the agreement needs to be released. Lawmakers need to see the terms. Markets need to understand the Hormuz timeline. Iran needs to understand the consequences of noncompliance. Israel needs to understand how its security concerns will be addressed. Gulf states need to understand their role. The IAEA needs access. Shipping companies need practical guidance. Ambiguity may help negotiators for a few days. It cannot sustain a deal for months. The second step is sequencing. No major benefit should be released without measurable implementation. That does not mean Iran gets nothing until the end. It means every step should have a corresponding step. First uranium tranche moves, first relief tranche follows. Enrichment suspension verified, next benefit follows. Hormuz traffic normalizes, maritime relief follows. Mine clearance progresses, shipping restrictions ease. Compliance must produce benefits, but benefits must not outrun compliance. The third step is enforcement, cannot become a debate that lasts 6 months while Iran gains time. The mechanism for reimposing pressure must be fast, credible, and not easily blocked by outside powers. If snapback depends on international consensus that Russia or China can delay, Tehran will notice. If the blockade can be reimposed quickly under agreed terms, Tehran will notice that too. The fourth step is coalition maintenance. Qatar and Oman played key roles, but the implementation architecture must be wider than mediation. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, Israel, Europe, and Asian energy consumers all have stakes. Not all of them will agree on everything. The United States has to keep enough of them aligned to prevent Iran from exploiting divisions. The fifth step is follow-on diplomacy on proxies and missiles. This cannot be allowed to vanish into a vague future track. Iran's nuclear stockpile is the emergency. Its regional network is the chronic disease. Treating the emergency does not cure the disease. If the proxy issue is not addressed with seriousness, the deal's opponents will eventually find their opening. The sixth step is domestic legitimacy. A deal born from war and coercion needs political grounding. If Congress feels excluded, the agreement becomes vulnerable. If the public thinks hidden concessions exist, suspicion grows. If the administration oversells the deal as total victory, every unresolved issue becomes a scandal later. Better to be honest now. This is a major framework, not a final piece. It reduces the nuclear danger, but it does not solve Iran. It opens a path, but the path is dangerous. That honesty would make the deal stronger, not weaker. Overselling is one of the fastest ways to destroy credibility. If officials say the Iran problem is solved and a proxy attack happens 2 weeks later, critics will call the deal a fraud. If officials say the deal is a strong first step that must be enforced aggressively, they create room to respond to problems without looking surprised. This is where the narrative of America won becomes tricky. America may have won the coercive phase. It may have forced Iran into concessions. It may have demonstrated air power, intelligence dominance, and escalation leverage. But the strategic victory is not complete until the deal survives pressure. A framework is not the finish line. It is the beginning of a stress test. Iran will test it. Israel may test it. Militias may test it. Markets will test it. Congress will test it. China and Russia will test the broader American posture around it. That is why the next chapter may be less dramatic than the strikes, but more decisive. A B-2 strike produces images and awe. A uranium transfer produces paperwork, seals, containers, and verification logs. A radar strike produces smoke. A compliance regime produces inspection schedules. A blockade produces pressure. A phased relief structure produces arguments over benchmarks. A war produces emotion. Enforcement produces fatigue. And fatigue is where adversaries look for opportunity. Ghana. Iran's leadership has survived for decades by waiting out pressure, exploiting divisions, and turning time into leverage. It may try to do so again. The United States must assume that every ambiguity will be tested, every delay will be used, every split between Washington and Jerusalem will be widened, every bank hesitation will be blamed on bad faith, every proxy incident will be wrapped in deniability, every inspection dispute will become a sovereignty argument. That is not cynicism. It is realism. The deal can still work under those conditions, but only if it is built for them. In the end, the most important line in the transcript may not be the triumphant claim that Iran handed over uranium. It may be the warning that the details matter more than the headlines. That is exactly right. The headline is easy. The details decide history. If Iran's enriched uranium is fully transferred and verified, the deal becomes a major achievement. If enrichment is suspended under real access, breakout risk drops sharply. If Hormuz stays open and shipping returns safely, the economic foundation strengthens. If relief phased properly, incentives remain aligned. If proxy talks become binding, the region may become safer. If China and Russia read the outcome as proof of American resolve, the strategic effect extends beyond the Gulf. But if uranium accounting is incomplete, if enrichment resumes quietly, if Hormuz remains under IRGC pressure, if money moves faster than compliance, if proxies escalate, if Israel acts independently, if Congress turns against the deal, or if the enforcement mechanism proves slow, the framework could unravel quickly. That is the knife edge. This is not a moment for triumphalism or fatalism. It is a moment for disciplined attention. Iran may have made a concession once thought impossible. That deserves recognition. But the United States and its partners now have to do something more difficult than forcing the concession. They have to make it irreversible enough to matter. That means no blind trust. No premature victory laps. No hidden side deals. No vague proxy promises. No sanctions relief without benchmarks. No public certainty before verification. No assumption that Iran's strategic character has changed simply because its cost-benefit calculation shifted under pressure. The regime has not become a friend. It has become constrained. That is progress. It is not peace. The best way to understand this agreement is as a bridge. On one side is the war. Strikes, blockades, drones, damaged infrastructure, oil market panic, and nuclear fear. On the other side is a possible regional order where Iran is farther from nuclear weapons, Hormuz is open, Gulf states are safer, Israel is less likely to strike, and the United States can shift attention back to broader strategic competition. But bridges can collapse. They collapse when too much weight is placed on them too quickly. They collapse when engineers ignore stress points. They collapse when foundations are weak. They collapse when people celebrate crossing before the structure is complete. This framework is a bridge under construction. The uranium transfer is one pillar. Hormuz reopening is another. Verification is the steel. Phased relief is the counterweight. Coalition support is the foundation. Proxy restraint is the missing section that still has to be built. The question is whether the United States can build fast enough, carefully enough, and firmly enough before the bridge is tested by the forces already gathering around it. That is the real story. Not just that Iran agreed to hand over uranium, but whether the world can verify it, enforce it, and prevent the next war before the last one has truly ended.